Here's the topic, so we go to the next slide. Now, I just wanted to mention something. Sharon is with us. It's very strange for me to talk today because I wasn't sure how many people would be here, but it never crossed my mind that I would know everyone that's on. And some people I haven't seen in a long, long time. Other people I've seen more recently. But it's a wonderful feeling. But it's a little strange feeling. It's been at least a year since Mel, or I call Melvin, is not with us. In my mind, or my eyes, he was the best of teachers, the best of madrachim, the best of friends. One thing, there'll always be controversy over his, what did he stand for and what was important to him, what was not important. But, you know, he was a Zionist without a doubt. We know where he spent his final days. But he was also a universal humanist. That mattered to him very, very much. All people, everyone concerned about everything, not just about things that are Jewish and not just about Jews, which I think is an important aspect of who he was. The one other thing I'd like to say about T.Y., because, you know, we all remember Mel, and everyone seems to know Mel over all the years. But the one thing that I would say is someone from an older generation, when I went to Tel Yehuda, it wasn't just Mel. I mean, Mel was there, but there were a whole coterie of other people. Someone, Barry Friedman, who Mel worked with. There was a Mo Sugarman, Joel Schwartz, who was my Merakez, Mike Rosenak. We had all these great, what we called, and we thought of then, and we still think of today, with the great educational figures. Mel was one of them. The difference between Mel and all these other people, Mel stayed in Young Judea. They went on and did other things, whether they be rabbis, professors, etc. Okay, so let's go on to my topic. I'm going to be talking about Jews from Arab lands in Israel, what happened to them in the 1950s, and what I didn't know when I was in Merakez. I was in Bordeaux about, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, teaching it around the time of Yom Kippur in France. And I went to break the fast at a doctor's house outside of Bordeaux. After services, we went by car to his house. We get out to a suburban home, and the guy's a doctor, his wife's a doctor, and there were about 21 people breaking the fast. And there were a lot of Moroccan Jews there, and they had all these sweet things for Yom Kippur. I enjoyed it. But there's one thing that struck me. Out of the 20 people, besides my wife and myself, 18, 16 of them were MDs. And all but one was Moroccan. In other words, one was Ashkenazi, all the others were Moroccan. And I said to my wife, but I said to them afterwards, it was just strange for me because I, at that time, was like an Israeli. And when you think of Moroccans, in Israel, you don't think of doctors. And it was just, this was France. And I mentioned here Chaim Adler, who was a famous professor at the Hebrew University, who was once a Shaliach to Young Judea. He said the Moroccans in France are different than the Moroccans in Israel. The key to understanding the difference are development towns. The Moroccans in Israel went to development towns. In France, they didn't. Now, when I was on the year course in 61, 62, I was on kibbutz in Old Mordechai. At that time, it was the wealthiest kibbutz in Israel. Today, it's an old age home. But there was my kibbutz family, there was a girl, Michal. And on the kibbutz, there were all these kids from Aliyat Noah, Youth Aliyah, from Hadassah, but the Israeli version of it, where they took kids from development towns and they brought them to kibbutzim. So on the kibbutz, with this whole group of kids, they were grown up already. They'd come in Aliyat Noah. Most of them were Moroccan, but from some other places as well. But for example, Michal had once been in love with someone called Shimshon, who was originally from Turkey. And her family forbade it. They were all Czech Jews. Most of the people on kibbutz, Czech and Argentinian, all Ashkenazim. And there was a lot of tension over the dating of these Aliyat Noah kids with the girls on kibbutz, etc. There were also kibbutz factories. Nod had 3 factories. All the workers were from Kiryat Shmona. No one in the kibbutz, just the manager and a couple of technicians were kibbutzniks. All the others were the people from Kiryat Shmona. On the year course, we did 1 month of special work. So I went with 7 others to Kiryat Gat, and we assisted in the schools. We taught we didn't really teach English, we just sort of helped out. What I remember about these Moroccan kids, I remember going to some place for Elijah, a monastery outside of Afula or something like that. And as we walked down the hall and we saw Jesus, everyone spit. They said, Yeshu, and they spit. But, you know, we saw poverty like we never saw. We saw a different Israel in Kiryat Gat. We realized, you know, it was different. Okay, let's go on. So TY, what did I teach? What did I understand? I saw it, and I got this probably from the Shluchim, or I got all my sifot my first year from Mel Reisfield, 11 o'clock the night before. I'd sit with him and David Ruderman. Mel would give me all the points. But it was a question of values. You had Israel founded by European Jews. They had modern Zionist values, etc. Jews from Arab lands were traditional, etc. It was harder for them to adapt, easier for the European immigrants to adapt. Again, they were religious, primitive, especially the Yemenites, very poor education, the Moroccans, a lot of illiterate people. And of course, they didn't know anything about democracy. Israel's a democratic country. Who were the real beacons of democracy? Ben Gurion, where did he come from? He came from a very democratic and progressive place called Poland. So their absorption, of course, was much slower. We have to understand that. It's only a question of time. Again, it's the mid-60s in Israel. Next slide. I met my wife in New York the month I finished I got my PhD. I couldn't do two things at the same time. My wife's name is Rachel. They're from Baghdad. And when we decided to get married next July, I went to Israel to meet her father to ask for her hand. So I go to this house in Tel Aviv, which was almost a shack. But they lived in Tel Aviv in Hadar Yosef. He had been a police officer, the only Jewish police officer in Iraq. I sat at the table on his right. I had the seat of honor. And he started telling me things about Israel, about racism and prejudice and the way they were treated and their loss of dignity. And one uncle who worked for El Al, in the conversation came up, well, El Al lets people go to New York. So his comment to me was, well, the blacks don't go, meaning referring to himself, etc. He'd never have a chance to go to work in New York for El Al, etc. Now, when my father-in-law was a policeman and he came to Israel, he'd been an officer in the Iraqi army, they laughed at him and they said, well, you can start, you know, we'll give you a job in the police department or something, and then you can work your way up. Stories that an aunt told me about Haifa when they came, how the hospital was segregated. Jewish women from Arab countries gave birth in one part of the hospital, the Ashkenazim were in the other part. And my sister-in-law at the dining room said to him, be quiet already. He won't get married to your daughter. He won't marry Rachel. You're going to turn him off. And here I was, a young Judea Zionist. Everything is great in Israel, etc. Then I did my research. Okay, let's go on. I'll try to do this as quick as possible. The Yishuv, the early state, the myth of the melting pot. Ben Gurion never wanted a melting pot. He culturally wanted to remake them in the image of the values of Mapai Party. The most important thing was going to be a secular Jewish society. You can look at what Ben Gurion did as the nation building, which all these people coming from all over the world, we had to create something unified, or else think of Mao and the Cultural Revolution. Next. Now, massive immigration between 48 and 60. We went from about 600,000 to 2 million. Two groups, Holocaust survivors from Europe, Jews from Arab lands, North Africa, and the Middle East. If you look at the Ashkenazi, how were they treated? Holocaust survivors don't speak to us about the Holocaust. You went like sheep unto slaughter, sabonim. Look at some of the movies, the one about shooting the gun on the beach, or the summer of Via, and other things like that. The Sabras were kibbutzniks. They were ashamed. They were ashamed of the Holocaust. How could you go like sheep unto slaughter, etc.? We don't want you shtetl. We don't want you Yiddish. We speak Hebrew here. Today, at every university in Israel, there's a chair in Yiddish studies. You couldn't study Yiddish in 48 at any Israeli university. They weren't interested. When it came to Eidot Mizrach, we're going to turn you into Israelis. Let's just go on. We'll come to that in a minute, etc. So both groups are really rejected. The Mizrahim are coming. Potential conflict. European Jews established and dominated the country, and they expected these people that are different than us are going to become like us. Ben Gurion wanted to create a new secular Jew. The problem with the Mizrahim was, one, many of them were religious. They had a religious Jewish identity. They saw their return to Israel as fulfilling biblical prophecy. More important, they were a traditional society, which meant the elders run the family, run the lives of everyone else. Their authority. What happens in Israel? As Kishon once said, it's the only country in the world where parents learn Hebrew from their children. That's a very cruel thing. All of us that came as immigrants to Israel. I once lived in Israel. The difficulty of learning the language and all of that. So what happens? You have all these Mizrahi families. The kids become Israelis before the parents. They lose respect for the parents. The parents don't understand what the country is all about. They don't listen to their parents. You break up the whole family structure and all of that. And then the country, the people, the educators, the teachers, the leaders, they refer to these people as being primitive. I interviewed Yitzhak Shamir in the 1980s. He still talked about, when I asked him about the 50s, they were primitive people coming in. The fact that the Iraqis had more doctors per capita of any Jewish community in the world, that doesn't matter, etc. They're Levantine, they're Arabs, the desert generation. Dor HaMidbar. What happens to the Dor HaMidbar? They die. So the parents of the Dor HaMidbar, the children of the future of Israel, as one God at Ben Gurion University once told my father-in-law, he was reading the New Testament, he was from Baghdad, I don't know why he was reading the New Testament, they took away my dignity. That's what Israel was about for a lot of these people. Next slide. We'll try to finish up now. But there were objective factors. They came late. They didn't come when the state was founded. They had less social capital. They had less money, less education. They didn't get reparations. Their leaders sometimes went elsewhere. The Labor Party provided them with housing, jobs, health care, and created dependence on the Labor Party. You don't vote for Labor, you lose your red card, you don't get health care and other things like that. What about the regional situation? There was segregation. The most important thing is they were sent to the boondocks. When Israel is going to grow and develop, it's going to happen in the center of the country, not in the boondocks. Education is second rate, third rate, fourth rate in the development towns. But take a region like the Galil, or take Lachish in Kiryat Gat. You have segregation. Kibbutzim have great education, even though many of them are very poor in the beginning, like Chatzerim in the 760s, before you got Netafim. What it was like, I remember being there, breaking the Yom Kippur fast. I don't remember reading fast. Hamburgers were the size of a silver dollar. That was your meeting meal, but you get all the potatoes from one. But it's segregated. In other words, Kibbutz has its schools, Moshav has its schools, and the worst schools are in the development town. When they industrialize in Israel on the regional level, who gets the factories? The Kibbutzim in the regional center. The regional unit, nothing in the development towns except for making clothes and things like that, these factories, etc. What about the military? The questionnaire on the military that many people might have filled out, where was your father born? Born in an Arab country, you're not going to become an officer. Universities, before all these junior colleges all over Israel, started by many of the kibbutzim, by the way, but open up to everyone. Universities were elitist, very hard to get into a university. Where are the worst schools in Israel? In development towns. And what do they do to even make it worse? They take the brightest kids out of the development towns and they send them to some elite boarding schools. Some boarding schools are not so elite. So the schools even are worse. And just one sign of a development town, military girl teachers. UJA used to publicize it. A sexy girl, attractive, she's teaching in the classroom. She had 2 months of training in the military to become a teacher. My kids' teachers in Tel Aviv have 10 years of experience. That's the difference. Next, move on. Okay, forget about the map of Israel. We all know Israel. Next. Everything's going to change between 67 and 73. 67, tremendous victory, etc. 73, the country almost was down the tubes, as some people remember. Next. Okay, so along comes Begin and Likud. Let's go on. Next slide. I'm sorry he's going to come afterwards. I want to finish up. Culture of Jews in Arab land. What happened to them in 67? See this movie, Valley of the Tears, but some of you live in Israel, you live with it day and night. You see the conflict between the kibbutz and the development town. 67 war was the war for the Sfaradim. It's our war. Not that other people didn't fight, but we fought. We proved ourselves. They made up the majority of the soldiers. It might not have been the majority of the pilots, but they were the soldiers. So they have this sense, it's like a tribal society. How do you prove yourself? You're in the military. You fought. So our fathers, our sons, our brothers fought like everyone else. We're Israelis like Avus Basi. And in other words, they want to move politically and culturally from the periphery to the center. And I'm just going to finish up with one more slide and we'll end it. Next slide. I don't know if that's the one I want. Let's see. Menachem Begin. Okay. I hated Begin. I never liked Begin. I never voted for Begin. But I wrote a book about Project Renewal. It also came out in Hebrew, by the way. And all of a sudden, I realized what Begin did. Begin, when he got elected in 77, he opened up his party, and the Sfaradim just weren't figureheads. You had David Levy and another dozen. They became a central part of the party, even though most of the leaders remained Ashkenazi for a long period of time. He opened up the Histadrut. He opened up the army. In other words, he made it easier for everyone to compete to become officers. And you have in the late 90s, that's so fair. I call them it's so fair. Vilnaid versus Mufaz. Who's going to be the head of the army? You know, he's from Haifa, he's from Reali School, and everything else. Mufaz got it, which is almost from Iran, born in Iran. That's the change of the guard. But what else did Begin do? He increased economic opportunities. Now, the joke used to be, Begin gives away videos. Like cleaning lady got a video, whatever they called it, not video, which you used to record on television. She got one before I did, my cleaning lady. I couldn't afford it as a university professor. So Begin gives away the videos, the TVs, and everything else. But what else did Begin do? Begin put a washing machine in everyone's home. So the Jews from Arab lands also went to politics, etc. Begin opens up the political system, the economic system, etc. So by the time you get into the 80s, 90s, they're much more a part of Israeli society. Forget about culture, which we're not going to talk about today. So that's what I didn't know as the Merakez, the reality of Israel. And the final point that I would just make, the same thing happened with Ethiopians.
Next slide.
The poorest group in the country, poorest group that came, they didn't have education, everything else. So what do? You put them in the periphery, even though you knew you should have put them into, the term they used was communities with strong infrastructures, which is a euphemism for the central part of Israel. They didn't make it, they couldn't afford to be in the central part of Israel. And you put them into a second-rate school system. The first time in Israel's history where a family could not decide whether to send their child to state secular or state religious was with the Ethiopians. They all had to go to state religious schools, second-rate school system. That was a payoff to the Mafdal. Thank you.
Fred, did you get to the last slide?
No, that's it. Here's
That's it.
Mufaz and Vilna E. And then Mufaz also beat out Tzipi Livni in an election within her party at one time. Okay, any questions or comments?
Okay. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Any questions? I don't see any questions in the chat.
I'd like to ask Fred. Freddie, where do things stand today?
Oh.
Have we progressed at all?
I think without a doubt, I think the country has progressed tremendously. Universities are, one of the things that's fascinating about Israel, progressed at all. There are other people in Israel. There are also Arabs in Israel. Take a look at sometime. I still can't figure out how this works. Take a look at the figures of Israeli Arabs, the percentage of Israeli Arab students that study at the Technion. It's over 20%. I mean,
They have a quota there.
What?
They have a quota.
No. Okay, I doubt it. I doubt it. Well, the quota might actually keep them down rather than raise the numbers. But I also think that I don't keep up. Since I left Israel in 2010, I don't keep up with the way that when I lived there and I knew. So I don't really want to talk about the present. But one of the things that when I was still active in development towns and things like that, by the year 2000, there was still a disaster when it came to education in most development towns. Here and there, some of them picked up, etc. But I think also one thing that's happened with a lot of kibbutzim, for example, in a lot of areas, when they started losing members and they didn't have money in that, they opened up their schools.
Mm.
So that would be a change. That would be a sign for the future. The other thing is, if you take all these michlelot is a democratization of higher education in Israel, which means a lot more people get opportunities. I was in a chug at Ben Gurion University called Behavioral Sciences. They were all cognitive psychologists. They're nuts, but they're brilliant. But they only wanted the brightest students. And the only thing that mattered to them was not their SATs, whatever that's called, Bagrut or whatever the exam is. Look at, I took college boards. You take a graduate record exam. I don't know how I get into the University of Chicago, but my advisor who told me when I graduated from UMass, cum laude, and I said, should I go to Germany after UMass? If I have a summer off, should I go to Germany to study German, or should I go back to Israel and improve my kibbutz? And he said, Mr. Lazin, if I were you, I would go study English. I saw your GRE scores. I don't do well in tests. I could never get in. I couldn't get into the department I was teaching at Ben Gurion University. What happened? They opened the Mechlah in Kiryat Gat. As a professor, you could double your salary almost if you taught there. But who were the students? The students couldn't get accepted for behavioral sciences at Ben Gurion. So what did they agree to do? We'll lower the we'll forget about test scores. Why? Because we want the money. Mm-hmm. So that opened up opportunities for more people. So I think things have changed in the military, in the economy, in education, etc. Nothing changes overnight.
Freddie,
intermarriage is also a factor.
Yes. Freddie has a question. She has her hand up.
Not a question, just a comment. I wanted to bring it full circle back to young Judea in that maybe ignorance was bliss, that we didn't know about these things. We didn't know about religious divides. We didn't know about Arabs. We didn't know about politics. And I think that was one of the special things that we all had in common in young Judea, that we were very egalitarian. And we weren't political, and we weren't religious, and we weren't secular, and we weren't Mizrahi, and we weren't Sfaradi, and we did debkas, and we did Yemenite steps, and we got hooked on it.
I agree.
Thank you for that. for those of us who went on your course, we got exposed to a lot of the diversity, you know, depending on when we went. Israel was a different Israel in 61 when you went, Fred, versus I went in 79. It was a different Israel than the kids are going now. So,
yeah, you know, we forget, you know, when you think of 61, when I think I was in Israel, 61, 62, Israel was only 12 or 13 years old. It was a very poor country. You know, remember, there used to be a joke about toilet paper. You know, you have to carry newspapers around every place. I mean, the country didn't have a lot of things. I remember Chatzerim. I was there in Yom Kippur of 63 when I went back to Israel. I visited Claire Lifton, who was on the kibbutz at the time. And I remember working in the pomegranate orchards, cleaning out the grass. My hands were covered with blood, but at the end of the day, I actually worked during Yom Kippur. At the end of the day, to eat pomegranates with the blood on your hand and the red juice, that was heaven. And I remember the meal with the silver dollar hamburgers and things like that. It was a poor country, etc. So, you know, you have to take all of that into consideration. One thing that I was trying to remember the name, there was a famous professor at the Hebrew University who was a fan of Menachem Begin. And they once did This Is Your Life, the Hebrew version of it, about this professor. And they commented to him was, someone once made some comment about you, the professor, that you were similar to Ben Gurion. Now, was that an insult? They said to the professor, since this professor was in love with Begin, he thought Begin was Israel's savior. And he said, no, it's a compliment. He said, without Ben Gurion, we wouldn't have a state of Israel. If Begin had been prime minister, we probably wouldn't have survived. And what was his point? He said, Begin was willing to disperse the population, send people out into the middle of nowhere with nothing, hundreds of thousands of people who were going to suffer for years. Ben Gurion was a man of steel. He lived with it. Ben Gurion, he said, would have cracked. When he lost boys, when he went in to take Jaffa in the Iyyun, he almost had a breakdown. Ben Gurion was a man of steel. That was, you know, the 50s was a difficult time in Israel.